Hello everyone. It's a distinct pleasure for me to contribute to this particular session and talk about model reusability, which I believe facilitate wider application of modeling in assessment of bioequivalence. As usual, my conflict of interest will be available publicly as part of the slide set later on. This slide is a reminder from 4 years ago and indicates that we have passed the stage of if we need modeling and simulation, and we are discussing only how we should be applying modeling and simulation. Modeling and simulation helps us with many aspects, including translation of bioequivalence from healthy volunteer studies to different disease populations, as well as with complex generics. And even in very rare occasions, we are having these differences, for instance, between different populations and so on, but we can figure them out using modeling and simulation, and therefore not all cases warrant clinical studies. This is another reminder from last year when we were talking about the modality of using modeling and simulation. For many people, modeling and simulation comes with a specified modeler in the form of what I call toys for big boys. But what we are trying to achieve is actually modeling for all in a way that the modeling becomes an integrated part of assessment of bioequivalence. And it is in this context that the reusability feeds into the discussions that we had last year on model master file. Okay, what is reusability? This is the way that Wikipedia actually defines it. As you can see, the context is only related to the software, and the reuse of part of the code in the next set of the codes that you are generating per passo is considered as full reusability, while if you are modifying some of that and then using in the next stage of the software development, then that is considered as leveraging. You can see at the top that number one, this is work in progress, and not everything is fully settled, but also you notice that this is only debated, discussed in relation to software code. Well, how reusability then applies to the models, at least there is one indication in literature from 2013 that defines the reusability in the context of models. However, for the purpose of the research that I'm going to share with you, we had to extend these, and we looked into not just full reusability, which is piece of the model that is basically reused in its entirety, but we also considered partial reusability, which is the same as leveraging that you saw in the case of the software, and also defined external reusability in the form of reuse of a model by a group of investigators that they had no links with the original group of researchers who developed the model, as opposed to the internal reusability, which is the reuse of the same model by the group who had generated it. The research that I'm going to share with you and analysis of the literature is a follow-up to the debate piece published in CPT-PSB in 2021, and apparently was one of the highest citations within that journal in 2021. All the definitions of software, platform, model, data, open source code versus non-open source code platforms are taken from that article. And in this piece of research, we identified 145 reports as original PBPK model development pieces and followed their citations. The left-hand side graph is the breakdown based on the platforms that they were reported in this 145 articles that I mentioned. Over 1,800 citations made to these original PBPK model developments. However, fewer than 300 involved any reuse cases. The results are summarized in star graphics, and one thing to note is only 40% of the open source code platform cases were reused. And to make the picture even worse, only 60% of this 40% reuse cases involved external reuse. Therefore, overall number for the reuse cases of open source code platform cases of PBPK was 24%. The same information here is provided as previous slide with addition of the time trend in the use of each of these platforms. Here is another way of looking at the data with a color code that separates between the open source code platforms versus non-open source code with hashed area indicating the platform that switched from one format to another in 2016. Here are the individual breakdown for the two non-open source code platforms, SimSip and GastroPlus. You can see the numbers based on each of these software. The reuse cases were, as I mentioned earlier, were much higher than the open source code, and also the external use were very high, both for SimSip and GastroPlus. In contrast, the most popular open source code platforms used for PBPK, they are not showing signs of high reusability with 19% and 25% in each of those two cases shown in these graphs. When we put all the open source code platforms together, this is the picture. The numbers are summarized: 42% reused, 54% of the reuse cases were external, and 12% of the reuse cases involved full reuse case. In the second part of investigation, we dived deeper into the use of the open source code platforms. This picture is showing geographical distribution, and as it is evident, the open source code platforms, they are much more popular in Europe than, for instance, US. The time trend for the areas, the application indicated much diverse use of these platforms in different areas as opposed to the first 10 years in this period. However, even in the recent years, toxicology, absorption, and animal PBPK dominated the application areas of open source code platforms, and clinical pharmacology was much smaller piece. More options of platforms were available in the recent years for the PBPK modeling within the open source code platforms. However, it was not as equally distributed as it used to be 10 years ago. Industrial applications of open source code platforms for PBPK, even after combining with the regulatory, was quarter of what was used in research organizations and academia. Certain platforms were preferred for certain areas, and there were rare occasions that one platform was used broadly in different areas of application of PBPK. Moreover, the impact of turning from charge to free was investigated for one of these platforms against the overall trend in general use of PBPK, and it was indicating that possibly making this platform free has had some impact on its higher usage. In general, the PBPK applications with open source code platforms was dominant in the area of toxicology, and also there were some local preferences. Data are not shown. For instance, in Germany, for a German product, open source pharmacology PK-Sim, and similar trends were also observed in Japan. This is my final slide, and before offering the points that I would like to be part of the panel discussion, I would like to acknowledge unpublished research work by Hamza Al-Dibani and Jamal Rajput at the University of Manchester. The points that I am offering for panel discussion is a debate on misplaced emphasis that was put on open source code platforms in several of the grant application offers. I believe the emphasis should be on quality assurance and reusability of the models, which are not in fact in favor of open source code platforms. Multiple factors determine the external reusability of all of different models, and some of them are subjective, but some others are objective functions that are related to quality support and the structure that they are in place for reuse of these by wider group of modelers. Increasing the reuse cases is an urgent need, and of course, historical clinical data in FDA can play a big role. However, not all the data, particularly laboratory data, might be available for such modeling, and whenever is needed, such data should be generated. With that, I would like to thank everybody for listening.